Hello everyone. Welcome to an episode of Junkyard Boost. Today I'd like to go over my 1986 GTI Mark II swap. It is a rust bucket, or it was a rust bucket. It's soon to be sold. It was a rust bucket. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. And I wanted to share some of the things that have been gone over before many times by other people. I just wanted to share my experience with you guys. I've already said a lot, but I need to put this in the front. There are a lot of people who have gone over this swap. Jake Rawson is a YouTube name that made a video on these particular swaps. He went in depth off of the Vortex list, which is great. The Vortex list is great for your driveline, mechanical components, what have you. So I'm not saying that I'm the only person that's done this. There's thousands of people out here who have done this swap. There's a bunch of information. I just wanted to share my experience and talk about some of the hurdles that I had to jump over to get this thing even working. So there we are. Let me back up. I bought a rolling shell, and a B4 Passat with a factory 12-valve VR6 in it. It was running OBD1, so no code reading allowed, without paperclip pins and flashing lights. And I was super excited about it. It was something I've seen done. I had a friend back in Montana that had one that kind of opened the door for a Mark II swap for me, seeing one in person, and fully committed, right? Accepted the assignment. And then started reading and digging and found all of the information that if you're at this video or just watching because you think I'm an idiot or want to see whatever, like, you've probably already been deep searching or looking for some answers for some stuff. So I just want to explain what I did, what I went through, and really wanted to break down one of the hardest parts of the swap for me. So I started with a donor car, which was the B4 Passat, and a shell. The shell had no motor in it, and that was that. I used, per requirements, a Mark III subframe from a Jetta Golf GTI. I used the Passat front motor mount cross member, and I also used the Passat radiator support. So my front end is essentially a Passat. My rear K-frame is a Mark III subframe. Now, I used Mark II A-arms to keep the factory track width of the GTI the same as essentially factory specs. There are VR6 A-arms. There are Mark III A-arms that you can use. VRs, I believe, have the wide track, which is about an inch wider. So if you run the wide track up front, you either need to swap the rear beam to make the rear beam wider to match the wheel width, or you have two different offsets or two different widths of track. I didn't do that. I wanted to retain. I didn't actually want to do any of it. It was what I had, and so I kept the Mark II A-arms. I kept the Mark II knuckles. I ran Mark II hubs, brakes. All of that was on the Mark II, and so I left it that way. The front end, I used, let me get my list here of what I did and how I did it. Mark III subframe. I used Mark II A-arms. You can use Mark III A-arms. I used the Passat front motor mount and motor mount cross member and the radiator cross member. You can use a Corrado setup for the front end, I believe. You can also use a Mark II stock Mark II radiator support and run a Mark II radiator or a Mark III radiator. The reason I went with the Passat one is because it's straight and it allows the radiator to sit slightly lower than the Mark II. I didn't have access to a Corrado at the time, but it sits slightly lower than the Mark II and sits straight in the bay, which allowed me to have a little bit more clearance off of the alternator where the fan shroud sits. If you're in it this far and you've done some things, you'll understand what I'm talking about, or if you've done it before, you'll understand what I'm talking about. There's not a lot of room in there with factory components, which is why a lot of guys run slim fans or their own radiator fan control setup. I only had access to factory components and or junkyard components at the time, so that's what I was using. The next thing you're going to need, mechanically speaking, is the hydraulic clutch master cylinder bracket. It's a brake booster bracket. It's mounted behind the brake booster to then hold your hydraulic cylinder or your clutch cylinder in place. You have to drill a hole through the firewall to then attach it to the pedals, which brings me to my next point. You need a set of Passat pedals. I don't know if you can swap other pedals. Maybe Corrado's bolt up as well. If you want to go hydraulic clutch, keep it factory VR setup, you need to swap the pedals out of your Mark II. There are cable shift kits that you can use. I didn't want to do that. I was trying to not buy, new parts. I really wanted to just see if I could do it. And so I sourced the brake booster bracket for the clutch. The booster bracket can be found on Passats or Corrados. I don't know if they came on 2-liter Jettas and Golfs. I just know I found mine on Passats that did not have the ABS setup. It's a non-ABS booster bracket is what you need to find. So when swapping the pedals, I used the Passat pedal setup. When swapping the pedals, you pull the brake booster off and mount that bracket with the brake booster when you're putting the new pedals on. Drill the hole through the firewall, mount your master cylinder up, connect the pedals, have fun with the white clip because it's terrible, and you're good to go. Mechanically, the only other things you need are a Mark III fuel tank with a Mark III fuel pump, and I'm sure you can run a Motronic or Jetronic or whatever they call those systems. I'm sure you could run a Mark II pump. I didn't. I was able to find a Mark III tank, and I put that in. You can use Mark II straps, tank straps. They're a little tight. You can do it. Or you can use Mark III straps, which is the best recommendation from the forums. Mechanically, we've went through the business. I'm not going to take time to explain the differences in axle setup or track width any further than I already have. Just know that if you go with one setup, if you go with Mark II A-arms, right, everything is off of the Mark III subframe or K-frame. If you go with Mark II A-arms, you then need Mark II tie rods for the distance. You need Mark II length axles with 100 millimeter flanges for the O2J or O2A, whatever transmission you're going to run, and whatever driveline components that change the width, you need to then adjust other components. So again, that's why I went with Mark II, because I had it and I could get the axles. Great. This is a big portion of this build for me, was when I got to the wiring. Now, when you're looking for Mark IIs, they came with a couple different setups, 3 different setups, electrically speaking. We're going to start latest generation and work our way back. 1989, 1990, 91, and 1992 had what's called a CE2 fuse block. On a2resource.com, you can go through and see the differences between CE2 and CE1, which leads me to the earlier generations. 1989 and prior, and I only say 89 because I know 89 is kind of a crossover year depending on which car you get. 1989 and prior are either CE1, which is great if you acquire that swap or that shell with that wiring. They're either CE1 or they're the US wiring variant. Jake Rawson in his video goes over the differences between CE1 and CE2. For the sake of getting it out of the way, CE2 is mainly a plug-and-play setup, whereas you have the engine harness for the VR6 and the F plug G1 plug and G2 plug on the fuse block, then plug in, and you can run your motor with a couple odds and ends, injector power, power to fuse block, blah, 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 D plugs, swapping, pinning, all that stuff. It's CE2 is your best bet. If you get lucky and you find one in that generation, good on you. If you find a CE1 fuse block car, you can still piggyback, from my understanding, you can still piggyback the wiring off of the CE1 block to then get the motor to run. I didn't do that. I got screwed. Upon further investigation, realized quickly that I had the US wiring harness fuse block, which is all common ground. All the wiring in the kick panels of those VWs is a disaster, but this one was really bad where I wasn't sure how I could pin in, pin out specifically for the motor. I'm sure there's ways to splice in or piggyback and run two fuse blocks, one for your motor, one for your interior controls. I was far enough in at this point where I stripped the entire car. So what I ended up doing was I lost all my interior functionality because I didn't really need it. The car had rusted floorboards, so I wasn't really concerned about having heat or AC or a radio. I just wanted to build kind of a sketchy go-kart to see if I could have some fun with it, and it was a hell of a lot of fun. So what I did was I stripped all the wiring, and I had sourced from the Passat, or any CE2 car really, I had sourced the components I need to get the motor running. There's H1, H2 plugs, I believe it's the H plugs that are the steering column controls. I sourced those from the Passat. I sourced the engine harness from the Passat. The fuse block came from the Passat. Everything at that point for me was plug and play. Now when I went to do this and I went to swap over the CE2 wiring, I also needed the ignition cylinder, right? Where the key goes in and all the wires plug into the steering wheel, or the stalks, if you will, the blinkers and windshield wipers and all that. I needed that, so I pulled that off and swapped the column mounted ignition switch into that car, into the GTI, so that I could retain the key on switch, I could retain power to fuse block, and I kept it as plug and play as I possibly could, because once I was that far in, I was scrapping the existing, look at that squirrel, getting a peanut, nice. I was scrapping the existing wiring, and I was dead set on getting the motor to run. Once I had the CE2 block installed, I knew that in order for me to get any sort of interior stuff in there, that it would all have to be CE2, because I did not want to depin and repin to the heater core or the radio controls or any of that. So I just deleted all that, put the dash back in with nothing in there, and I ran it like that for a while. Its entire life I ran it like that. So you can do it. If I were to do it again and I had a clean enough shell for it, I would have figured out a way to run two fuse blocks in tandem, delete the engine wiring from the US wiring harness, and then tap the positive key on controls to both the interior controls and the motor controls, so that, you know, I could retain some sort of function inside the car. And that's if I had a clean enough shell to do it. The other things, the other benefit of a CE2 swap for me, if you're in that position for me, was to be able to run the rear harness to the fuel pump. So I could run the rear harness to the fuel pump. I could also run the taillight harness to the taillights. There's a bit of splicing involved for the brake switches and stuff like that to then link it all together, and a lot of reading. But that was what I ended up doing. I ran all the CE2 wiring from that fuse block to the rear. It allowed me to run a CE2 Mark III cluster, and that worked great. It also allowed me to run the Passat lighting harness to the front lights. Now, we're getting outside of the realm of just a motor swap, but if you wanted it to be road legal, which I did, it was barely road legal. that's how I did it. So I'll attach photos, or I've attached photos, I would hope, at this point to, you know, kind of help understand what it is I had to go through and how it was I worked through some of these problems. I had help through this from people who have done some similar things like this before, but there wasn't a whole lot of information on the US wiring go. So once I was in, I stripped it, I let it rip, and I had a lot of fun. That car is going to be sold with all the swap components here this weekend, and the new buyer plans on swapping all of those components into a clean, originally 16 or I believe 8 valve GTI of the same generation. So he needs all the wiring, and I'm just gonna give him all of the solutions to all of the pain that I went through finding out that I had the wrong fuse block for ease of installation. So for what it's worth, I wanted to put this out here and explain a little bit about my experience doing a Mark II swap. And if it helps you, great. If you have questions, you can comment on it. If you want to know more about the wiring specifics, because I did depin and repin some stuff and then converted it to OBD2 and supercharged it, went standalone, blah, blah, blah. I'm happy to answer those questions because I have been that guy in the garage with no answers searching through the forums for a long, long time. And for all you old guys who have done this swap 100 times, be nice to the new kids because they're just learning how to do it. And if they're trying to scrap a old VW that you want, then just go buy it from them and fix it yourself. But don't be an ass to new kids getting into this scene, because it was a lot of fun for me. You know, I've worked on stuff my entire life, so I knew how to spin a wrench. I just didn't know the ins and outs, and we don't need to hold these secrets like they're gold, you know. It's more fun if your buddies have cars that they can bring to the meet, as opposed to one dude stuck in his garage and won't stop calling you, because I've been that guy. So anyways, I hope this helped. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Until then, stay sketchy and wear your seatbelt. Peace. Oh boy, we are very, very close. Everything's almost wired in. We got crank.